Forward! For Rome!
We march!
Why would a Roman commander risk an entire army on a tactic so untested? His own officers warned it was madness. And why, centuries later, would the Senate quietly ban it from use? Not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. For centuries, Rome's legions fought in ways the world could measure: ranks, formations, shields, swords. But alongside the familiar, there were tactics whispered about in veteran camps, recorded in fragments by hostile scribes, and hinted at in inscriptions on weather-worn stone. These were the maneuvers that didn't make it into polite histories, because they weren't just about winning. They were about ending wars before they truly began. The stakes were never abstract. In the Republic's early centuries, defeat wasn't just a setback, it was an existential threat. Rome was surrounded by enemies who remembered her as a struggling city-state, not a superpower. A single disaster could unravel alliances, invite rebellions, or open the gates to invasion. And so, when Rome fought, she fought to annihilate, not to negotiate. But here's the question: if Rome's standard formations and discipline were already the envy of the ancient world, why risk the unpredictable? Why experiment with tactics so ruthless they would terrify allies as much as enemies? The answer lies in the kind of wars Rome fought. They weren't set-piece duels between equals. They were struggles against enemies who learned, adapted, and often outnumbered them. By the late 3rd century BCE, Rome's generals knew the dangers of predictability. The defeat at Cannae in 216 BCE was proof enough. Hannibal had read their playbook, then torn it apart in front of them. From that humiliation came an unspoken rule: Rome must never allow herself to be outthought again. Every generation of commanders was expected to develop innovations, small or large, that could shift the balance before the enemy even realized the rules had changed. Some of these innovations became standard: the manipular system, the integrated use of auxiliary cavalry, the disciplined retreat. Others remained shadows in history, known only from hints in military treatises or from the strange accounts of Rome's enemies, who could not explain how they had been beaten. In this investigation, we'll uncover 5 of these lesser-known tactics. One was used so decisively in Gaul that an entire tribal confederation dissolved overnight. Another relied on psychological pressure so relentless it forced surrender without a sword being drawn. Subscribe before we start, because we're about to uncover the 5 deadliest tactics Rome ever used. Prepare yourself, we begin. 1. Later in the empire, was so devastating in siege warfare that Roman senators feared it would be turned against their own cities. And there's a deeper truth here. These tactics weren't born in marble halls or drilled endlessly on parade grounds. They came from the minds of men under pressure, commanders with reputations at stake, centurions desperate to save their cohorts, and soldiers whose survival depended on breaking the enemy's will before their own failed. Unknown to them at the time, many of these innovations would echo far beyond their original battlefields. The principles behind them, deception, shock, and control of terrain, still appear in modern special operations doctrine. So as we step into the campaigns where these tactics first appeared, ask yourself, in their place, with everything on the line, would you have dared to try them? Why were the Roman legions feared in every corner of the known world? It wasn't only their courage, it was the way they turned war into an organized system where every soldier, every weapon, every supply cart had its place and purpose. The legions weren't just an army, they were a machine. A Roman legion was more than a mass of men with swords. It was a carefully built structure. At the top, a general, often a consul or a proconsul, set the strategy. Below him were senior officers, the legates who commanded entire sections of the army. Then came the centurions, the beating heart of the legion, tough, battle-tested men who led small groups of 80 soldiers each. These units were called centuries, and 6 centuries made a cohort. 10 cohorts made a legion. The structure allowed the army to break apart and move quickly, or come together as one unstoppable block, depending on the fight. But structure alone doesn't win wars. Discipline did. Roman soldiers trained every single day, even when there was no war. They marched 20 miles with full gear in the heat of summer. They practiced sword strikes using wooden weapons twice as heavy as their real ones, so that in battle the steel felt light and fast. And if a man broke formation, if he hesitated when ordered to advance, punishment was swift and harsh. In the worst cases, an entire unit could be decimated. 1 in every 10 men executed to make sure no one forgot the price of failure. The Romans also had a genius for tools and engineering. Their main throwing spear, the pilum, wasn't just for killing. Its long, soft metal point bent on impact, so an enemy couldn't throw it back. And if it stuck in a shield, the shield became useless. Their siege engines, giant catapults, towers on wheels, and battering rams could be built on site from local wood, allowing them to attack fortified towns quickly. Then there were the roads. Roman roads didn't just connect cities, they connected armies to their supplies. A legion could move faster than almost any enemy force, carrying with it food, weapons, and even spare parts for siege equipment. Wherever they camped for the night, they built a fort from scratch, with ditches, walls, and gates so well made that archaeologists can still find their outlines today. But perhaps the greatest advantage was their flexibility. Rome stole ideas from every enemy it fought. The Spanish sword, the gladius, became the Roman standard. From the Greeks, they learned new formations. From the Carthaginians, they studied cavalry tactics. If something worked, they used it, and often improved it. This flexibility made the legion dangerous in ways that enemies often didn't understand until it was too late. Rome could fight in open plains, where heavy infantry could form a wall of shields and push forward like an iron tide. They could also fight in forests, sending small groups to harass and ambush. They could cross rivers under enemy fire, or march through mountains in winter. But there was another layer to their strength, the way they thought about battle itself. To Rome, a fight wasn't just about killing the enemy, it was about breaking their ability to fight at all. That might mean cutting off their food, surrounding them, attacking their allies, or using tricks to make them panic. The tactics we'll uncover in this story didn't appear out of nowhere. They were born in this environment, in a system that valued discipline, clever thinking, and the ability to adapt. Some came from long planning, others from desperate moments when a commander had only hours to make a choice that could save or destroy the army. One such tactic began with a simple observation. An enemy will often trust what they see more than what they feel. If you can make them believe they are winning, even as you set a trap around them, you can end a battle before it starts. Rome learned this lesson from bitter defeat at the hands of Hannibal, and when they turned it to their own use, the result would be one of the most complete battlefield victories in their history. That's where we go next, to a dusty plain in Hispania, where a young commander would use that idea to crush a larger force. The plan was bold, the risk enormous, and if it failed, Rome's name in the region might have ended there. But if it worked, it would become the first of our 5 deadliest tactics. The year was 209 BCE, and the war with Carthage had dragged on for more than a decade. In Spain, the Carthaginian armies were strong, well-supplied, and confident. The Romans had been beaten there before, their commanders killed, their legions scattered. Rome needed a victory, not just to win land, but to prove to its allies that Carthage could be beaten on its own ground. The man sent to make that happen was young by Roman standards. Publius Cornelius Scipio was only in his mid-20s, yet he already carried the weight of his family's name. His father and uncle had both been killed in Spain, fighting these same enemies. For Scipio, this was more than strategy. It was personal. When he studied the enemy's camp near the city of Baecula, he saw something important. The Carthaginian general, Hasdrubal, had placed his army on a hill with steep slopes protecting the front. It looked safe, but Scipio noticed that the sides were less guarded. Most commanders would have attacked head-on, grinding their way up the hill. But Scipio thought differently. He decided to use what we now call the triple line envelopment. It's a tactic Rome had seen before, painfully, at Cannae, where Hannibal had surrounded and destroyed a much larger Roman army. But Scipio made a key change. Instead of letting his center collapse, he would keep it firm and use hidden reserves to snap the trap shut at the perfect moment. Here's how it worked. He arranged his army in 3 layers. The front line advanced up the hill slowly, making enough noise and movement to keep Hasdrubal's focus forward. At the same time, 2 strong forces began to move along the flanks, climbing the less defended slopes. They stayed out of sight as long as possible, using the rough terrain for cover. Hasdrubal believed the Romans were attacking straight on. He committed his best troops to hold the center. By the time he realized his sides were being attacked, it was too late. The flanking forces reached the top almost at the same moment. From there, they poured down on the Carthaginian troops from behind. The trap snapped shut. Surrounded, the Carthaginian soldiers panicked. Those in the middle couldn't move without colliding with their own men. The Roman front line now pushed harder, driving them toward the flanking forces. Some tried to escape down the far side of the hill, but the Romans had placed cavalry there to cut them down. The fight didn't last long. Hasdrubal himself escaped with a small guard, but his army was shattered. The Romans captured the camp, the supplies, and the city. It was a victory that broke Carthaginian power in that part of Spain and gave Rome a base for the rest of the war. What made this tactic deadly wasn't just the idea of attacking from three sides, it was the timing. If Scipio had sent in his flanking forces too early, the enemy could have pulled back and escaped. Too late, and his own men in the center would have been overwhelmed. It took discipline from every soldier and clear signals from the officers to make it work. There's also something else to notice here. Scipio didn't invent the concept. Hannibal had already used a similar move against Rome, but Scipio improved it. He kept his center strong so the trap couldn't collapse inward. He also used terrain and concealment so that the enemy didn't see the flanking move until it was too late. Modern military strategy still uses this principle. In both world wars and even in recent conflicts, you see versions of this same tactic. A main attack that fixes the enemy in place, while hidden forces move around to cut off escape. For Rome, Baecula became more than a victory. It became a lesson. The enemy's strength could be turned into a weakness if you could force them to commit to the wrong part of the field. That lesson would appear again and again in Roman history, sometimes in open plains, sometimes in dense forests, sometimes even in city streets. And it also showed something about Scipio himself. He wasn't just brave, he was patient. He could let the enemy believe they were holding the line, even when every move brought them closer to disaster. That patience and his eye for opportunity would one day help him face Hannibal himself at Zama in the battle that ended the Second Punic War. The first of our 5 tactics, then, is this: the perfected triple line envelopment. It's not the kind of thing that wins by a narrow margin. When it works, it destroys an enemy force completely, and for that reason, it was feared, copied, and remembered for generations. But Rome's deadliest moves weren't always about surrounding the enemy. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon wasn't a sword or a spear, it was the Senate chamber. The next tactic on our list was born not in battle, but in politics, and it could ruin a man's career, topple a general, or decide the outcome of a war before the fighting even started. Why would a commander on the verge of victory slow down and wait? Why give the enemy time to breathe, regroup, maybe even strike back? In Roman strategy, this wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was the deadliest move of all. The tactic was born in the heart of Roman politics, and it thrived because of the way Rome fought its wars. A Roman general was not just a soldier, he was also a politician, and every battle he won or lost could shape his career. The Senate could grant or take away his command, reward him with a triumph, or strip him of all honor. In that environment, controlling the timing of victory could be as important as the victory itself. One of the clearest examples comes from the final stages of the Juguthine War in 105 BCE. Jugurtha, the cunning king of Numidia, had been fighting Rome for years. He knew how to avoid set battles, how to bribe Roman officials, and how to use the desert terrain to his advantage. Many Roman armies had failed to capture him. When Gaius Marius took command, he changed the approach. Marius was a soldier's soldier, tough, relentless, and willing to endure the same hardships as his men. He began a grinding campaign, pushing Jugurtha into tighter corners. By the time Marius had him nearly trapped, another Roman commander, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, arrived with fresh orders from the Senate. Sulla was ambitious and clever. He negotiated directly with a Numidian prince, Jugurtha's own relative, and persuaded him to betray the king. Jugurtha was captured, but not by Marius on the battlefield. Instead, Sulla claimed the credit, arranging for his name to be tied to the final act of the war. To the soldiers, this was politics at its worst. But to the Senate, Sulla's version of events was neat, quick, and bloodless. It made them look efficient. Marius had done the hard fighting, but Sulla took the glory at the perfect moment. This is the victory delay tactic, not rushing to finish the enemy when you can let circumstances or politics deliver the win in a way that serves your reputation. The danger of this tactic is obvious. It risks the war dragging on longer, costing more lives. But the reward for those who time it right is enormous. The one who claims the decisive act, even if they did not fight the decisive battle, can shape how history remembers the war. It wasn't just used in distant Africa. During Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, the Senate in Rome often debated whether to recall him. Rivals like Pompey waited for moments when Caesar seemed stalled, hoping to step in at the last minute to share or steal the glory. Caesar knew this and sometimes pushed for battles even when the conditions weren't perfect, simply to keep control of the narrative. The victory delay could also be used against foreign enemies in a more direct way. By holding back on a final strike, Rome could keep an enemy leader alive just long enough to use them as leverage, forcing them to sign treaties, hand over allies, or betray other enemies. Once their usefulness ended, the final blow would come quickly. Archaeological evidence shows that in some sieges, the Romans intentionally slowed their assaults after breaking through the outer defenses. This wasn't because they lacked the strength to finish the job. It was to let hunger, disease, and fear do more damage than their weapons could, breaking the defenders' will without costly urban fighting. When the gates finally opened, the victory seemed effortless, and the commander looked like a master of patience and control. But there's a darker side to this. In a society where political survival mattered as much as military success, the victory delay could lead to unnecessary suffering. Citizens in besieged cities starved while rival Roman commanders argued over who should lead the final attack. Soldiers died in skirmishes while their leaders played for advantage in Rome. From a purely tactical standpoint, though, delaying a victory could force the enemy into making mistakes. Desperate for relief, they might march their forces into bad terrain or accept a battle they couldn't win. The key was knowing just how long to wait before striking. Too short, and you gained nothing. Too long, and you risked losing the chance altogether. In the case of Jugurtha, the tactic worked perfectly for Sulla's career. He used the capture to build his reputation, and in time, it helped him challenge even Marius himself for power in Rome. But it also left a sour taste for those who had fought and bled for years without seeing their general given the credit he deserved. The victory delay shows us that Roman warfare was not just fought on battlefields. It was fought in the minds of senators, in the speeches to the people, and in the timing of every move. In Rome, winning well could matter more than winning fast. This tactic also teaches a lesson that still applies today. In politics, in business, even in personal rivalries, the person who ends the contest isn't always the one who started it, and the one who delivers the final act often controls the story forever. The next tactic could not be more different. It had nothing to do with patience, politics, or waiting for the perfect moment. It was about speed, shock, and hitting the enemy so hard and so fast that they never even had time to fight back. And in the hands of a Roman legion, it could turn a risky situation into a crushing victory in minutes. Why would an army that had been marching all day suddenly attack at full speed, with no rest, no formation adjustments, and no warning to the enemy? Because sometimes shock and exhaustion in the right mix could break even a stronger opponent. This was the Roman hammer march. The idea was simple but brutal. Use the march itself as a weapon. Most armies of the ancient world expected an enemy to halt, form lines, and prepare before battle. The Romans learned that if they moved fast enough, they could skip that pause entirely, turning the final mile of the march into the first charge of the fight. One of the clearest examples comes from Caesar's campaign in Gaul in 58 BCE. Facing the Helvetii, a migrating tribe with tens of thousands of fighters, Caesar knew he was outnumbered. His only advantage was speed. Scouts reported that the Helvetii were moving in long columns, with their wagons trailing behind. If he struck quickly, before they could form a battle line, he might split their force in two. So Caesar marched his legions hard through the night and into the morning, keeping them in a flexible column that could fan out fast. When they reached the enemy's position, instead of resting, the Romans went straight into the attack. The Helvetii were caught mid-movement, some still at their wagons, others rushing to grab weapons. The sudden pressure shattered their coordination, and the Romans pushed them back before they could mount a full defense. The hammer march worked because it attacked both the body and the mind. The enemy's legs were already tired from moving. Their minds were set on stopping and regrouping. The shock of being hit at that moment made them slow to react, and slow in battle was often fatal. But this tactic was dangerous. A legion that marched into battle without pause risked fighting while exhausted, dehydrated, or disorganized. Commanders had to know their men could take it, and that meant weeks of training to march in heavy armor without losing cohesion. Archaeological finds of Roman hobnails, the iron studs from their sandals, scattered on old battlefields, show just how far they were willing to push their troops before a fight. It also required perfect timing from the commander. Too early, and you arrived before the enemy, forcing your troops to wait and lose the momentum. Too late, and the enemy would be rested, formed, and ready. The hammer march was about hitting the exact moment when the enemy was least prepared, and your own men still had the strength to strike hard. There was also a psychological factor. Soldiers who could pull off a hammer march felt almost unstoppable. They had beaten the enemy in endurance and in combat in the same stroke. That kind of confidence could carry over into the rest of a campaign, making the legion more aggressive and fearless. Not all hammer marches were planned in advance. Sometimes, a commander saw an unexpected chance, dust on the horizon showing an enemy moving, or scouts reporting a camp still half asleep, and made the split-second call to turn the march into an assault. Those were the riskiest because there was no time to prepare the troops mentally, but when they worked, they could win battles before the enemy even realized one had begun. The hammer march shows the Roman genius for turning ordinary actions into deadly weapons. Marching was something every army did. The Romans turned it into a surprise attack that could crack open the toughest opponents. The next tactic was even stranger. It wasn't about speed, shock, or patience. It was about letting the enemy come straight at you, and then making them regret every step. In Rome's hands, defense was not a passive shield. It was a trap, and the more the enemy thought they were winning, the more certain their defeat became. Why would a commander give up ground to the enemy on purpose? Why let them think they're pushing you back? In Rome's eyes, that wasn't weakness. It was bait. This was the killing ground, a tactic where the battlefield itself became the trap, and every step forward by the enemy was a step closer to disaster. The idea was to lure the enemy into a position where they lost their advantages, and where every Roman strength could hit them at once. Sometimes it was a narrow pass, where only a few men could fight at the front. Other times it was an open plain with hidden ditches or sharpened stakes. The point was always the same: control the place where the fight would be decided. One of the most famous uses of this came in 197 BCE at the Battle of Cynocephalae during Rome's war with Macedonia. The Macedonian king, Philip V, commanded a phalanx, a massive wall of spears that was almost impossible to break head-on. In open ground it was deadly, but the Roman commander, Titus Quinctius Flamininus, knew that the ground near the hills of Cynocephalae was uneven and broken, perfect for disrupting the phalanx's rigid formation. When Philip moved to attack, the Romans fell back just enough to draw the phalanx into the rough terrain. The long spears began to tangle, the ranks started to break apart, and suddenly the Roman maniples, small, flexible units, were slipping between gaps and cutting the Macedonians to pieces. What looked like a retreat had been the opening move of a killing blow. The killing ground didn't always rely on natural terrain. The Romans often made their own. At the Battle of Watling Street in 60 CE, Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus faced Boudicca's rebel army, which outnumbered his troops several times over. He chose a narrow defile, backed by a forest, with open space only in front. He lined his legions in a wedge formation, with javelin throwers ready. When the rebels charged, their sheer numbers worked against them. Funneled into the narrow front, they couldn't outflank the Romans. The legionaries threw their pila into the packed mass, then surged forward in tight, disciplined lines. Behind them, the forest prevented any surprise attacks. By the end, the field in front of the Romans was a wall of bodies. The rebels had walked into a trap from which there was no escape. Tactically, the killing ground worked because it multiplied Roman strengths, discipline, flexibility, and coordination, while stripping the enemy of theirs. A cavalry-heavy force could be funneled into ground too narrow to maneuver. An archer-heavy force could be drawn into close combat. A slow, heavy infantry could be made to fight uphill or in mud where they couldn't hold their line. Archaeological digs at ancient battlefields sometimes reveal the hidden details of these traps. Rows of stakes buried in front of a Roman line, shallow trenches designed to trip charging cavalry. even stone cairns or markers showing where Roman commanders pre-measured killing distances for their javelin volleys. These weren't accidents of war, they were crafted killing zones, but the tactic wasn't without risk. If the enemy recognized the trap too soon, they could stop, pull back, or force the Romans to attack on their terms instead. That's why deception was often a key part of setting up the killing ground. A fake retreat, a seemingly hasty camp, or an unfinished fortification could convince an enemy that the Romans were vulnerable. In reality, every move was calculated to draw them into the perfect position for destruction. There's also the psychological side. An enemy that thought they were winning, pushing the Romans back, seeing them flee, could become overconfident. They might rush forward faster than planned, break formation, or ignore orders. By the time they realized they'd overextended, the Romans would have already closed the trap. In his position, would you risk it? You'd be giving the enemy space, sometimes even ground you'd already taken, in hopes they would walk into your chosen spot. If they didn't take the bait, you'd have to fight them in a less favorable position. But if they did, the battle could be over in minutes. Modern military thinkers still study this principle. It's not just about physical space. In modern warfare, a killing ground can be an electronic zone where enemy communications are jammed, or an air corridor covered by overlapping missile systems. The heart of the tactic is the same. Make the enemy fight where you are strongest, when they are weakest. The killing ground showed the Roman belief that victory wasn't just about bravery or numbers. It was about shaping the fight before it began. In Rome's mind, the battle didn't start when swords clashed. It started when they chose the ground. The final tactic we'll uncover was different from all the others. It wasn't about charging faster, holding longer, or trapping the enemy in a perfect spot. It was about making the enemy fight themselves, turning their own strength into the weapon that destroyed them. And in one of Rome's bloodiest wars, this tactic didn't just win a battle, it broke an empire. How do you defeat an army without striking the first blow? Rome had an answer: make them destroy themselves. This was the tactic of turning the enemy against themselves. It meant using fear, distrust, and divided loyalties to shatter an enemy before the main battle even began. Sometimes it was done through spies and false messages, convincing a commander that his allies were about to betray him. Other times, Rome would secretly supply one faction of an enemy coalition, encouraging them to fight each other. By the time the Romans marched in, their foes were already weakened. One of the clearest examples came during the Jugurthine War in North Africa, around 112 BCE. Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, was a master of political manipulation himself. But Rome learned his game. Roman envoys spread rumors among Jugurtha's officers, suggesting that the king planned to sacrifice them to save himself. Distrust spread like wildfire. Officers defected, soldiers deserted, and when Rome finally attacked, the Numidian army collapsed from within. Another came during the wars against Mithridates of Pontus. Rome encouraged rival Greek cities to compete for favor, offering small rewards to those who sided with them. Soon, the unity of Mithridates' allies fractured. Instead of a single coordinated defense, Rome faced scattered, mistrusting forces that could be beaten one by one. This tactic relied on knowing the enemy's culture, politics, and personal ambitions. Roman commanders were often skilled diplomats as well as soldiers. They met with enemy leaders, praised their bravery, hinted at rewards, and quietly set rivalries in motion. Archaeology and ancient letters reveal just how deliberate this was. Inscriptions record treaties and rewards given to loyal cities right after a rebellion was crushed. Loyalty Rome had often engineered. Coins minted in newly allied territories sometimes show Roman symbols alongside local ones, proof of deals struck behind closed doors. In his position, would you trust your allies if you knew Rome had been whispering in their ears? Could you hold your army together if every man thought the man beside him might be the next traitor? By turning enemies against themselves, Rome avoided costly battles, saved soldiers' lives, and broke threats before they reached full strength. It was a tactic as much about patience and words as it was about steel and shields, and in the end, it showed the heart of Roman warfare: win the battle before it's fought, and the enemy never has a chance to recover.